Chapter 10. Julia accustomed herself to walk in the fine evenings under the shade of the high trees that environed the abbey. The dewy coolness of the air refreshed her. The innumerable roseate tints which the parting sunbeams reflected on the rocks above, and the fine vermilion glow diffused over the romantic scene beneath, softly fading from the eye as the night shades fell, excited sensations of a sweet and tranquil nature, and soothed her into a temporary forgetfulness of her sorrows. The deep solitude of the place subdued her apprehension, and one evening she ventured with Madame de Menon to lengthen her walk. They returned to the abbey without having seen a human being, except a friar of the monastery who had been to a neighboring town to order provision. On the following evening they repeated their walk, and, engaged in conversation, rambled to a considerable distance from the abbey. The distant bell of the monastery, sounding for vespers, reminded them of the hour, and, looking round, they perceived the extremity of the wood. They were returning towards the abbey, when, struck by the appearance of some majestic columns which were distinguishable between the trees, they paused. Curiosity tempted them to examine what edifice pillars of such magnificent architecture could belong in a scene so rude, and they went on. There appeared on a point of rock impending over the valley the relics of a palace, whose beauty time had impaired only to heighten its sublimity. An arch of singular magnificence remained almost entire, beyond which appeared wild cliffs retiring in grand perspective. The sun, which was now setting, threw a trembling lustre upon the ruins, and gave a finishing effect to the scene. They gazed in mute wonder upon the view, but the fast-fading light and the dewy chilliness of the air warned them to return. As Julia gave a last look to the scene, she perceived two men leaning upon a part of the ruin at some distance in earnest conversation. As they spoke, their looks were so attentively bent on her that she could have no doubt she was the subject of their discourse. Alarmed at this circumstance, Madame and Julia immediately retreated towards the abbey. They walked swiftly through the woods, whose shades, deepened by the gloom of evening, prevented their distinguishing whether they were pursued. They were surprised to observe the distance to which they had strayed from the monastery, whose dark towers were now obscurely seen rising among the trees that closed the perspective. They had almost reached the gates when, on looking back, they perceived the same men slowly advancing, without any appearance of pursuit, but clearly as if observing the place of their retreat. This incident occasioned Julia much alarm. She could not but believe that the men whom she had seen were spies of the Marquis. If so, her asylum was discovered, and she had everything to apprehend. Madame now judged it necessary to the safety of Julia that the Abate should be informed of her story, and of the sanctuary she had sought in his monastery, and also that he should be solicited to protect her from parental tyranny. This was a hazardous but a necessary step to provide against the certain danger which must ensue should the Marquis, if he demanded his daughter of the Abate, be the first to acquaint him with her story. If she acted otherwise, she feared that the Abate, in whose generosity she had not confided, and whose pity she had not solicited, would, in the pride of his resentment, deliver her up, and thus she would become a certain victim to the Duke de Luovo. Julia approved of this communication, though she trembled for the event, and requested Madame to plead her cause with the Abate. On the following morning, therefore, Madame solicited a private audience of the Abate. She obtained permission to see him, and Julia, in trembling anxiety, watched her to the door of his apartment. This conference was long, and every moment seemed an hour to Julia, who, in fearful expectation, awaited with Cornelia the sentence which would decide her destiny. She was now the constant companion of Cornelia, whose declining health interested her pity and strengthened her attachment. Meanwhile, Madame developed to the Abate the distressful story of Julia. She praised her virtue, commended her accomplishments, and deplored her situation. She described the characters of the Marquis and the Duke, and concluded with pathetically representing that Julia had sought in this monastery a last asylum from injustice and misery, and with entreating that the Abate would grant her his pity and protection. The Abate, during this discourse, preserved a sullen silence. His eyes were bent to the ground, and his aspect was thoughtful and solemn. When Madame ceased to speak, a pause of profound silence ensued, and she sat in anxious expectation. She endeavored to anticipate in his countenance the answer preparing, but she derived no comfort from thence. At length, raising his head, and awakening from his deep reverie, he told her that her request required deliberation, and that the protection she solicited for Julia might involve him in serious consequences, since, from a character so determined as the Marquis's, much violence might reasonably be expected. Should his daughter be refused him, concluded the Abate, he may even dare to violate the sanctuary. Madame, shocked by the stern indifference of this reply, was a moment silent. The Abate went on. "Whatever I shall determine upon, the young lady has reason to rejoice that she is admitted into this holy house, for I will even now venture to assure her that if the Marquis fails to demand her, she shall be permitted to remain in this sanctuary unmolested. You, madame, will be sensible of this indulgence, and of the value of the sacrifice I make in granting it. For, in thus concealing a child from her parent, I encourage her in disobedience, and consequently sacrifice my sense of duty to what may be justly called a weak humanity." Madame listened to this pompous declamation in silent sorrow and indignation. She made another effort to interest the Abate in favor of Julia, but he preserved his stern inflexibility, and repeating that he would deliberate upon the matter and acquaint her with the result, he arose with great solemnity and quitted the room. She now half repented of the confidence she had reposed in him, and of the pity she had solicited, since she discovered a mind incapable of understanding the first, and a temper inaccessible to the influence of the latter. With a heavy heart she returned to Julia, who read in her countenance, at the moment she entered the room, news of no happy import. When Madame related the particulars of the conference, Julia presaged from it only misery, and giving herself up for lost, she burst into tears. She severely deplored the confidence she had been induced to yield, for she now saw herself in the power of a man, stern and unfeeling in his nature, and from whom, if he thought it fit to betray her, she had no means of escaping. But she concealed the anguish of her heart, and to console Madame, affected to hope where she could only despair. Several days elapsed, and no answer was returned from the Abate. Julia too well understood this silence. One morning, Cornelia, entering her room with a disturbed and impatient air, informed her that some emissaries from the Marquis were then in the monastery, having inquired at the gate for the Abate, with whom, they said, they had business of importance to transact. The Abate had granted them immediate audience, and they were now in close conference. At this intelligence, the spirits of Julia forsook her. She trembled, grew pale, and stood fixed in mute despair. Madame, though scarcely less distressed, retained a presence of mind. She understood too justly the character of the superior to doubt that he would hesitate in delivering Julia into the hands of the Marquis. On this moment, therefore, turned the crisis of her fate. This moment she might escape, the next she was a prisoner. She therefore advised Julia to seize the instant and fly from the monastery before the conference was concluded, when the gates would most probably be closed upon her, assuring her, at the same time, she would accompany her in flight. The generous conduct of Madame called tears of gratitude into the eyes of Julia, who now awoke from the state of stupefaction which distress had caused. But before she could thank her faithful friend, a nun entered the room with a summons for Madame to attend the Abbate immediately. The distress which this message occasioned cannot easily be conceived. Madame advised Julia to escape while she detained the Abbate in conversation, as it was not probable that he had yet issued orders for her detention. Leaving her to this attempt, with an assurance of following her from the abbey as soon as possible, Madame obeyed the summons. The coolness of her fortitude forsook her as she approached the Abbate's apartment, and she became less certain as to the occasion of this summons. The Abbate was alone. His countenance was pale with anger, and he was pacing the room with slow but agitated steps. The stern authority of his look startled her. "Read this letter," said he, stretching forth his hand, which held the letter, "and tell me what that mortal deserves who dares insult our holy order and sets our sacred prerogative at defiance." Madame distinguished the handwriting of the Marquis, and the words of the superior threw her into the utmost astonishment. She took the letter. It was dictated by that spirit of proud vindictive rage which so strongly marked the character of the Marquis. Having discovered the retreat of Julia, and believing the monastery afforded her a willing sanctuary from his pursuit, he accused the Abbate of encouraging his child in open rebellion to his will. He loaded him and his sacred order with opprobrium, and threatened, if she was not immediately resigned to the emissaries in waiting, he would in person lead on a force which should compel the Church to yield to the superior authority of the Father. The spirit of the Abbate was roused by this menace, and Julia obtained from his pride that protection which neither his principle nor his humanity would have granted. "The man shall tremble," cried he, "who dares defy our power or question our sacred authority. The Lady Julia is safe. I will protect her from this proud invader of our rights, and teach him at least to venerate the power he cannot conquer. I have dispatched his emissaries with my answer." These words struck sudden joy upon the heart of Madame de Menon, but she instantly recollected that ere this time Julia had quitted the abbey, and thus the very precaution which was meant to ensure her safety had probably precipitated her into the hand of her enemy. This thought changed her joy to anguish, and she was hurrying from the apartment in a sort of wild hope that Julia might not yet be gone, when the stern voice of the Abbate arrested her. "Is it thus," cried he, "that you receive the knowledge of our generous resolution to protect your friend? Does such condescending kindness merit no thanks, demand no gratitude?" Madame returned, in an agony of fear, lest one moment of delay might prove fatal to Julia, if haply she had not yet quitted the monastery. She was conscious of her deficiency in apparent gratitude, and of the strange appearance of her abrupt departure from the Abbate, for which it was impossible to apologize without betraying the secret which would kindle all his resentment. Yet some atonement his present anger demanded, and these circumstances caused her a very painful embarrassment. She formed a hasty excuse, and expressing her sense of his goodness, again attempted to retire, when the Abbate, frowning in deep resentment, his features inflamed with pride, arose from his seat. "Stay," said he, "whence this impatience to fly from the presence of a benefactor? If my generosity fails to excite gratitude, my resentment shall not fail to inspire awe. Since the Lady Julia is insensible of my condescension, she is unworthy of my protection, and I will resign her to the tyrant who demands her." To this speech, in which the offended pride of the Abbate, overcoming all sense of justice, accused and threatened to punish Julia for the faults of her friend, Madame listened in dreadful impatience. Every word that detained her struck torture to her heart, but the concluding sentence occasioned new terror, and she started at its purpose. She fell at the feet of the Abbate in an agony of grief. "Holy Father," said she, "punish not Julia for the offense which I only have committed. Her heart will bless her generous protector, and for myself suffer me to assure you that I am fully sensible of your goodness." "If this is true," said the Abate, "arise and bid the Lady Julia attend me." This command increased the confusion of Madame, who had no doubt that her detention had proved fatal to Julia. At length she was suffered to depart, and to her infinite joy found Julia in her own room. Her intention of escaping had yielded, immediately after the departure of Madame, to the fear of being discovered by the Marquis's people. This fear had been confirmed by the report of Cornelia, who informed her that at that time several horsemen were waiting at the gates for the return of their companions. This was a dreadful circumstance to Julia, who perceived it was utterly impossible to quit the monastery without rushing upon certain destruction. She was lamenting her destiny when Madame recited the particulars of the late interview and delivered the summons of the Abate. They had now to dread the effect of that tender anxiety which had excited his resentment, and Julia, suddenly elated to joy by his first determination, was as suddenly sunk to despair by his last. She trembled with apprehension of the coming interview, though each moment of delay which her fear solicited would, by heightening the resentment of the Abate, only increase the danger she dreaded. At length, by a strong effort, she reanimated her spirits, and went to the Abate's closet to receive her sentence. He was seated in his chair, and his frowning aspect chilled her heart. "Daughter," he said, "you have been guilty of heinous crimes. You have dared to dispute, nay, openly to rebel, against the lawful authority of your father. You have disobeyed the will of him whose prerogative yields only to ours. You have questioned his right upon a point of all others the most decided, the right of a father to dispose of his child in marriage. You have even fled from his protection, and you have dared, insidiously and meanly have dared, to screen your disobedience beneath this sacred roof. You have profaned our sanctuary with your crime. You have brought insult upon our sacred order, and have caused bold and impious defiance of our high prerogative. What punishment is adequate to guilt like this?" The father paused, his eyes sternly fixed on Julia, who, pale and trembling, could scarcely support herself, and who had no power to reply. "I will be merciful and not just," resumed he. "I will soften the punishment you deserve, and will only deliver you to your father." At these dreadful words, Julia, bursting into tears, sunk at the feet of the Abate, to whom she raised her eyes in supplicating expression, but was unable to speak. He suffered her to remain in this posture. "Your duplicity," he resumed, "is not the least of your offences. Had you relied upon our generosity for forgiveness and protection, an indulgence might have been granted. But under the disguise of virtue, you concealed your crimes, and your necessities were hid beneath the mask of devotion." These false aspersions roused in Julia the spirit of indignant virtue. She arose from her knees with an air of dignity that struck even the Abate. "Holy Father," said she, "my heart abhors the crime you mention, and disclaims all union with it. Whatever are my offences, from the sin of hypocrisy I am at least free, and you will pardon me if I remind you that my confidence has already been such as fully justifies my claim to the protection I solicit. When I sheltered myself within these walls, it was to be presumed that they would protect me from injustice, and with what other term than injustice would you, sir, distinguish the conduct of the Marquis, if the fear of his power did not overcome the dictates of truth?" The Abate felt the full force of this reproof, but disdaining to appear sensible to it, restrained his resentment. His wounded pride thus exasperated, and all the malignant passions of his nature thus called into action, he was prompted to that cruel surrender which he had never before seriously intended. the offence which Madame de Menon had unintentionally given, his haughty spirit urged him to retaliate in punishment. He had, therefore, pleased himself with exciting a terror which he never meant to confirm, and he resolved to be further solicited for that protection which he had already determined to grant. But this reproof of Julia touched him where he was most conscious of defect, and the temporary triumph which he imagined it afforded her kindled his resentment into flame. He mused in his chair in a fixed attitude. She saw in his countenance the deep workings of his mind. She revolved the fate preparing for her, and stood in trembling anxiety to receive her sentence. The Abate considered each aggravating circumstance of the Marquis's menace and each sentence of Julia's speech, and his mind experienced that vice is not only inconsistent with virtue, but with itself. For to gratify his malignity, he now discovered that it would be necessary to sacrifice his pride, since it would be impossible to punish the object of the first without denying himself the gratification of the latter. This reflection suspended his mind in a state of torture, and he sat wrapped in gloomy silence. The spirit which lately animated Julia had vanished with her words. Each moment of silence increased her apprehension. The deep brooding of his thoughts confirmed her in the apprehension of evil, and with all the artless eloquence of sorrow she endeavored to soften him to pity. He listened to her pleadings in sullen stillness, but each instant now cooled the fervor of his resentment to her, and increased his desire of opposing the Marquis. At length the predominant feature of his character resumed its original influence, and overcame the workings of subordinate passion. Proud of his religious authority, he determined never to yield the prerogative of the Church to that of the Father, and resolved to oppose the violence of the Marquis with equal force. He therefore condescended to relieve Julia from her terrors by assuring her of his protection. But he did this in a manner so ungracious as almost to destroy the gratitude which the promise demanded. She hastened with joyful intelligence to Madame de Menon, who wept over her tears of thankfulness.